Jonah Goldberg. He is the author of this book, Liberal Fascism, which is a must. But now he has The Tyranny of Cliches, which is a little lighter than the happy face with the Chaplin mustache on it. This one, you actually take on the cliches, and we talked about some of them on the radio today. Sure. You know, let them eat cake, never said, and when you explain it, it's completely different.
Right.
Explain that one more time.
Sure. So, you know, FDR, liberals, Robert Reich, President Obama, all these guys, they always love to say about the rich, oh, their answer to everything is just let them eat cake. And historically, let them eat cake is what Marie Antoinette is supposed to have said to show how indifferent she was to the plight of the poor. And the reality is, first of all, she never said it. But second of all, the real phrase is let them eat brioche, which is like let them eat very expensive bread. And the reason why a limousine liberal of 18th century France would say that, or I guess it would be a gilded cage liberal, or gilded chariot liberal of 18th century France would say that, is because they had a law that said if you're a baker and you run out of cheap bread, you have to sell the expensive bread at the same price. And so this completely...
Which you could see our government doing right now.
Oh, absolutely, right. It's the equivalent of saying that if you run out of Pabst Blue Ribbon, you have to sell 18-year-old scotch at the same price, right? It completely blows up the market.
Right.
No one wants to make too much bread for fear of, you know, and so when you say, why don't they just eat brioche? Why don't they just eat expensive bread? It was a classic sort of limousine liberal, out-of-touch, economically illiterate approach to say, well, they should just eat the more expensive stuff. And the whole reason why you had a bread crisis, not the whole reason, but one of the reasons why you had a bread crisis in the first place was because, just like with rent control, how it screws up housing prices, the bread regulation screwed up the bread markets.
Right. It just as it would if you said, I mean, you know, the Pabst Blue Ribbon thing, but if you said, buy regular gas, and if you're out of regular, then you have to sell super premium at the same price.
Right.
That would screw up everything.
Everything.
Because the refiners and they wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
I mean, you would just not.
The history of the metric system turns out to be more or less the history of its constant rejection. Time after time that it's introduced, ordinary people have rejected the metric system. Remember at the beginning I explained how in each town in France, measures varied one to the other. And of course for travelers, for scientists, for state administrators, this was an enormous problem. How do you deal with long distances when measures differ from town to town? But for local people, these local measures were their ordinary daily use. They were something that in fact protected their local economies from traders from big cities. People wanted the protection that local measures afforded to their daily trades and businesses. And for that reason, they did not welcome the metric system. And what's more, measurement had an entirely different meaning to people 200 years ago than it does today. Measures, in some sense, were on the human scale. What does that mean? Does that mean that measures were like the foot? They were the size of a human foot? Well, it could, and sometimes did. But more often, it meant that measures were based on labor, on human effort. So, for example, people in the old regime 200 years ago measured fields, not in square feet, not even in surface area. They measured them in days. How many days does it take to reap the harvest? Or they measured them in bushels. How many bushels of grain does it take to sow the field? That's a pretty intelligent way, I think you'll agree, to measure fields if you're a peasant or if you're a farmer. It may not give you the surface area, but it tells you a great deal about the value of the land. And it also does something else if you think about it. It locks in an amount of labor. It sets a limit for what's appropriate in that community. For example, let's say a landlord had a 3-day field, and he asked some peasants to come and pick it in 2. You can be assured they're not going to do it. They're going to take the full 3. Local values were locked in by the old measure. And something else was different about measures in the old regime. There was one measure that did not vary, and that was price. The old regime operated according to what we would call a fair price economy, or a just price economy. That meant that for certain important foodstuffs, say bread, you could not raise the price. If bread cost 3 sous, it cost 3 sous. And if a baker dared to raise the price to 4, he would be pulled across the counter and lynched, or at the minimum start a food riot. So what did a baker do when the price of flour rose? He shrunk the loaf. Because there were multiple measures in use, he could shrink the loaf. Now, did people not notice? Were people foolish? Were they not aware that the loaf was smaller? No, I think they were. They were aware. But the principle was a different one. The principle was one of equity. Everyone could still afford a loaf of bread. So what does that make the metric system? It makes it a radical innovation. It allowed for comparisons of price for fixed amounts of measure. It allowed price to become the sole value that determined worth. And that was quite deliberate. The men who created the metric system believed that only with a new measurement system could you have free trade and open markets and create general wealth. And they had a political principle which went with that as well. If you can calculate, if you know what you're buying and selling, it's only then that you know your own best interest. Otherwise, you're completely befuddled all the time. If you know your own best interest, only then can you be free. It was a liberal principle, a principle of republicanism, and one that was closely linked to the equality that was one of the foundations of the French Revolution. That makes the metric system debate the first debate over globalization. On one hand, we have a set of scientists and men in the French government arguing that we should create a system that allows for free trade, that will create general wealth and lead to principles of political toleration and equality. And on the other hand, we have people resisting that, saying that they prefer to have their old measures, their old values defined locally so as to protect themselves from this global economy. 200 years ago, that debate was already beginning. And it was so fierce that 15 years after the metric system is first created, Napoleon is forced to rescind it. He bans the metric system in 1812. When I first told a French scientist about my project, quite a prominent man actually, he said, "Oh yes, of course, I know, the French invented the metric system. It's a familiar tale told in France." I said, "Well, actually, you know that the French actually rejected the metric system and Napoleon had to ban it." For a moment, he looked rather despondent, a little sort of upset, and then a sort of gleam came into his eye, and he said, "Ah, but that makes the French the first to reject the metric system. So either way, they're first." It is eventually returned to France in the middle of the 19th century with the advent of the railway, with the rise of public education, with increased trade and travel. Those local village economies do break down, and the old measures do start to die out. But it's not for 100 years until basically the early 20th century that the French finally do adopt the metric system in daily practice. So why is the United States still the only country in the world to not use the metric system? If Thomas Jefferson had had his way, the United States would have been second. We would have been the second country to adopt the metric system, and he was close friends with the men who had created it and was in constant communication with them. He was a little upset that they were measuring this meridian that ran through France. As he pointed out at the time, that meant that the standard was really based on something that no American could easily verify. And even though it was based on the world, it happened to be that part of the world that ran through France. But the real problem for Thomas Jefferson was convincing his fellow Americans to join the metric system. America actually was a rather unique country in that it had uniform weights and measures from the beginning. After all, the United States was the creation of a single colonial power, Great Britain, and by and large, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, from Maine to Georgia, the United States roughly used the same weights and measures. And that meant we didn't have the same advantage or incentive to switch. After all, we already had a measurement system that allowed for trade and communication well enough, and we didn't have the kind of anthropomorphic measures that were so repugnant to the men of science. And so, by and large, we have stuck with our old pounds and feet until recently. For the first time in the United States, we actually do have multiple systems of weights and measures in use in the United States. Tens of millions of Americans use the metric system every day. If they're in medicine, if they're in science, if they're in engineering, or at least most branches of engineering.